There was a building so significant that governments scrambled to erase every record of it after it fell. Not just the rubble, not just the blueprints, the photographs, the sketches, the traveller accounts, all of it pulled from libraries, archives and private collections within 14 years of its destruction. By 1701, if you went looking for proof it ever existed, you would find almost nothing. And what little remained had been quietly reclassified, misfiled or attributed to something else entirely. This is the story of the structure that historians eventually agreed to call collateral damage, a building that once sat at the centre of one of the most visited pilgrimage sites on Earth. A structure so advanced in its engineering that scholars who studied the fragments left behind could not agree on how it had been built, how long it had taken, or who, precisely, had authorized its construction. A building that the established historical record would prefer you think about as little as possible. And the reason they prefer that is simple. If you start asking the right questions about what was demolished in Athens on September 26, 1687, you stop being able to trust the timeline of civilization you were handed in school. Now, let us begin with what the official story admits. On September 26, 1687, a Venetian mortar round struck the Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens. The Parthenon, which had stood for more than 2,000 years, was at that moment being used as a gunpowder magazine by Ottoman forces. The mortar ignited the magazine. The central chamber exploded. 300 tons of marble were scattered across the Acropolis plateau. The explosion was visible from ships in the harbour miles away. That is the story. That is what they teach. But here is where it starts to fall apart. The Parthenon was not just a building. It was considered by every serious traveller who documented it between 1400 and 1680 to be in near perfect condition. The French ambassador's secretary, Jacques Carré, visited Athens in 1674 and produced a detailed series of sketches of the structure, its sculptures, its friezes, its proportions. His sketches show a building that was largely intact, roofed, functional and structurally coherent after more than 2,000 years of standing on an exposed hilltop in a seismically active region. 2,000 years, on a hilltop, in perfect condition. Think about that for a moment. We cannot build a parking garage today that survives a century without structural intervention. The Romans, who came after the Greeks, could not replicate what the Greeks allegedly built. Neither could the Byzantines, neither could the Ottomans, neither could the Venetians who destroyed it. And yet the building stood intact through the entirety of recorded Western history, right up until a mortar round ended it in an afternoon. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The official explanation for the Parthenon survival is that Greek builders in the 5th century BC were simply extraordinary craftsmen who had mastered marble joinery and proportional engineering at a level not equalled since. The columns, we are told, were built with deliberate slight curves to counteract the optical illusion of sagging. The marble was quarried from Mount Pentelicus 9 miles away and transported by ox cart. The construction employed 10,000 workers over 15 years. Fine. Except none of that explains the material itself. Pentelic marble, which the Parthenon was built from, has a documented weathering rate under normal atmospheric conditions. Scholars who have studied existing fragments have noted that the degree of weathering on the original construction material is inconsistent with a 5th century BC build date. The weathering patterns suggest, depending on which geologist or material scientist you consult, either an anomalous microclimate on the Acropolis plateau or a construction date that predates the accepted timeline by a significant margin. This is not a fringe claim. This is a data point that appears in material science literature and is then quietly left unresolved, because resolving it would require asking a question that the academic establishment is not prepared to answer. Namely, who built the Parthenon? And when, really. Now let us talk about what happened after the explosion. Francesco Morosini, the Venetian commander who ordered the bombardment, initially attempted to loot the surviving sculptural elements from the wreckage. His men attached ropes to the horses of the western pediment, the sculptural group above the main entrance, and tried to lower them for transport. The ropes broke, the sculptures fell and shattered. Morosini reportedly sailed away with only a few fragments and a great deal of embarrassment. But here is what the record does not linger on. Within a few years of the explosion, a systematic effort began to gather, restrict, and in some cases destroy the documentary record of what the Parthenon had looked like before September 26, 1687. Cary's sketches survived only because he had already returned to France, and his drawings were held in a private collection that did not cooperate with the consolidation effort. Had he been a week later, leaving Athens, or had his patron been less resistant to outside pressure, those drawings would be gone too. What was being gathered up? Traveller accounts primarily. The 17th century was an era of grand tour culture among wealthy Europeans, and dozens of well-documented travellers had visited Athens and the Acropolis in the decades before the explosion. Several of them had produced written accounts describing the Parthenon in detail. Some had produced their own sketches. A handful had commissioned paintings. By 1701, the vast majority of these accounts had been quietly consolidated. Some were declared lost in archives that, when later examined, showed no evidence of the usual deterioration that causes document loss. Others were recatalogued under misleading headings. One significant collection of pre-explosion Acropolis documentation held in Venice was reclassified as part of a military survey archive and made effectively inaccessible to civilian researchers for more than a century. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Now, you might say this sounds like the normal chaos of the early modern period. Archives were disorganized, libraries burned, records were lost constantly, except the consolidation was selective. Accounts of Athens that focused on street life, markets, and Ottoman administration from the same period survived almost entirely intact. It was specifically the detailed architectural documentation of the Acropolis structures that disappeared, and it disappeared within a very narrow window. 14 years, from 1687 to 1701. Someone knew what they were looking for, and they found most of it. Let us now talk about what the fragments themselves reveal, because this is where the Tartarian thesis becomes impossible to dismiss with a wave of the hand. When British diplomat Lord Elgin removed a substantial portion of the surviving Parthenon sculptures between 1801 and 1812, the pieces were transported to London and eventually installed in the British Museum, where they remain today over loud Greek objection. And here is the thing about those sculptures that the museum does not put on the placard. Next to them, the tooling marks on the Elgin marbles are wrong. Not wrong in the sense of being crude or inconsistent. Wrong in the sense of being inconsistent with the tools that 5th century BC Greek craftsmen demonstrably had access to. Certain finishing marks on the reverse faces of the frieze panels, the sides that would have been against the wall and invisible to any viewer, show evidence of mechanical consistency that hand chiseling cannot produce. The regularity of certain groove patterns, the uniformity of depth across extended cuts, the absence of the microvariance that appears in every authenticated example of hand-carved ancient Greek stonework from the same supposed period. These observations have been made by independent conservators and materials researchers. They appear in specialist literature. They are not engaged within mainstream classical scholarship. The standard response when pressed is that the Parthenon's builders were simply more skilled than other Greek craftsmen of the era, which is not an explanation, it is a deflection. There is a second anomaly in the material record that receives even less attention. Certain load-bearing column drums in the surviving sections show internal plug-and-socket joinery of a type that was not documented in Greek construction manuals of any era. The joinery is functional and geometrically precise. It serves no decorative purpose. It exists purely to distribute stress in a way that would require an understanding of tensile load distribution that classical Greek engineering theory does not account for. We have the texts. The Parthenon's joinery is not in them. It exists as if designed by someone working from a different body of knowledge entirely. If the tooling mark suggests mechanical assistance and the weathering pattern suggests a construction date earlier than the accepted timeline, and the structural durability across 2 millennia cannot be replicated by any construction method we currently attribute to 5th century Greeks, then we are not talking about extraordinarily gifted ancient craftsmen. We are talking about something else. The Tartarian framework proposes that what we call the ancient world was in significant part the inheritance of a prior civilization of considerably greater technical capability. That what we label as Greek, Roman and earlier construction was in many cases the adaptive reuse, modification, or outright misattribution of structures and technologies that predated classical antiquity. That the academic dating of these structures has been shaped not purely by evidence, but by the necessity of fitting those structures into a civilizational timeline that places industrial-scale technical capability firmly and exclusively in the modern era. The Parthenon, under this framework, was not built in the 5th century BC. It was already standing. The classical Greeks understood it as a sacred site and maintained it accordingly, adding their own decorative elements, their own sculptures, their own religious iconography. What they did not do was build the core structure. The core structure was inherited, and in 1687 a Venetian mortar round destroyed in an afternoon something that no civilization before or since has been able to build. The explosion itself deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives. Morosini's bombardment of the Acropolis was not a random act of war. The Venetians knew the Parthenon was being used as a powder magazine. Morosini knew. His artillery commanders knew. The decision to continue the bombardment of a known magazine inside one of the most celebrated architectural monuments in European consciousness was a decision, not an accident. Morosini wrote about it in his dispatches. He expressed regret about the damage. He did not express surprise. Why would you not be surprised when you shell a powder magazine and it explodes, unless the outcome was not unexpected, unless the destruction of the structure was, at some level, the point? This is where the argument becomes uncomfortable for people who have been trained to trust institutional history. The suggestion that a military commander in 1687 might have had reasons beyond tactical necessity to destroy a specific building is a significant claim. It requires either a conspiracy of intent or, more plausibly, an alignment of interests that made the destruction convenient for parties beyond Morosini himself. Consider what was known in European scholarly and ecclesiastical circles by 1687 about the Parthenon. It was not just admired, it was being studied, seriously studied. The proportional systems embedded in its construction were being analysed by mathematicians and architects who were finding things they could not explain. The building's relationship to our astronomical alignments was being documented. Its material properties were being noted by people who had examined a great deal of stone and knew that Pentelic marble did not behave the way the Parthenon's marble behaved. By 1687, the building was starting to ask questions that nobody with institutional authority wanted answered. And then it exploded, and then the records disappeared. Here is the final piece. When the great 19th century archaeological surveys of the Acropolis were conducted, the excavators found something in the foundation layers of the Parthenon site that was quietly removed from the primary published reports and relegated to supplementary technical appendices that were never translated from the original German. Beneath the classical era construction layers, beneath the evidence of 5th century BC building activity, the foundation surveys encountered a substrate of cut and fitted stonework that did not match the construction style, the tool patterns, or the material sourcing of anything else on the Acropolis. It was older, significantly older, and it had been the foundation on which everything above it was built. The published reports described this substrate as natural geological formation. The supplementary appendices, read carefully, do not describe a natural geological formation. They describe worked stone, stone that had been shaped and fitted before the first Greek hand ever touched the hill. The eighth wonder of the ancient world was not destroyed by a Venetian mortar round in 1687. That was just the final chapter. The real story is what was already there before the Greeks arrived, what they built on top of it, what survived for 2,000 years, and why, within 14 years of its destruction, the people who understood what had been lost made sure the rest of the world would not find out. The building is gone. The records have been thinned, but the questions remain. Every year, more researchers working outside the institutional framework find that the answers to those questions do not fit the timeline we were given. The anomalies accumulate. The suppressions follow a pattern. And the pattern points at something that was here before the Greeks, before Rome, before every civilization the textbooks begin with. Something that was capable of building a structure that outlasted every empire that came after it. Something that certain people in 1687 decided the rest of the world was better off not knowing about.